Wyoming Territory, 1873. The silence was the first thing a man learned to accept. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air that settled over the vast, sagebrush plains and pressed down on the shoulders. Caleb Blackwood had not only accepted it, he had cultivated it. Solitude was a fortress, and its walls were made of the immense, indifferent quiet of the land. He stood on the low rise overlooking his ranch, his gaze sweeping over the familiar lines of his world. The sturdy log house he had built with his own hands, the long, low barn, the meandering line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, and the endless expanse of grassland that was both his livelihood and his isolation. The wind, a constant companion, whispered through the tall grass, a sound like a slow exhalation from the earth itself. It was a lonely sound, but it was a predictable one. Caleb valued predictability above all else. His life was a series of deliberate, repeated motions. He rose before the sun, painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. He drank his coffee black and scalding from a tin cup. He checked his fences, tended his cattle, and worked the land until his muscles ached with a familiar, honest fatigue. He ate his meals alone at the long trestle table Martha, his cook and housekeeper, left for him before she retired to her own small cabin. He read by the light of a kerosene lamp, the pages of his worn books filled with other people's lives, a safe distance from his own. These rituals were the bedrock of his existence, a bulwark against the chaos that had once shattered his world like glass against stone. He had learned a brutal lesson in the years since the war, and in the seasons since the fever. To love was to build a house in the path of a flood. It was an invitation for ruin. He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking in the stillness. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the horizon, not for threats, but out of habit. He saw everything, the way a hawk circled on a thermal, a dark speck against the impossible blue, the shimmer of heat rising from the distant alkali flats, and, far to the south, the thin, dark line of the Union Pacific tracks, a scar of progress stitched across the ancient landscape. From this vantage point, he could just make out the cluster of buildings that was the town of Redemption Creek, a place he visited only when necessity demanded it. It was a place of noise, of people, of attachments. It was a place he avoided. A faint, mournful sound drifted on the wind, thin and high. The train whistle. It was Tuesday. The weekly train from Cheyenne was arriving, bringing mail, supplies, and the occasional fool with dreams of land and fortune. Caleb usually paid it no mind. It was a rhythm of the outside world, and he had long since turned his back on that world. But today, the sound snagged on something inside him, a dissonant chord in the quiet symphony of his day. He felt a prickle of uneasiness, a feeling he had taught himself to ignore. It was nothing. It was just a train. He turned his back on the town and walked toward his horse, the solid, dependable presence of the animal of comfort. He had work to do. The north fence needed mending. Work was a better fortress than stone. Work was a prayer to the god of forgetting. In Redemption Creek, the arrival of the train was an event that broke the monotony of the afternoon. Dust, stirred by the slowing behemoth of iron and steam, swirled like golden phantoms along the platform. The hiss of the engine was a monstrous sigh of relief, and the clang of the bell echoed down the single, wide street. Townspeople gathered, their faces a mixture of idle curiosity and genuine anticipation. For Alara Vance, the sounds and smells were an overwhelming assault on senses accustomed to the refined quiet of Boston. The air tasted of coal smoke, dust, and something wild and unfamiliar she could not name. She clutched her valise, her knuckles white, and took a deep breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of her heart. She descended the steep steps of the passenger car, her fine wool traveling suit, the color of a summer sky, now filmed with the grime of the long journey. It felt utterly alien here, a relic from another life. All around her were men in dusty denim and worn leather, and women in practical, faded calico. Their faces were weathered by sun and wind, their gazes direct and appraising. She felt like a canary set down in a flock of crows. She scanned the platform, her eyes searching for the man whose photograph she carried in her reticule. A solemn-faced man with a neatly trimmed beard and kind eyes. Mr. Elias Abernathy. Her future. The man who had promised her a new life, a home, a family, in his carefully penned letters. But the platform began to clear. Families reunited, supplies were unloaded, and the initial bustle subsided into the town's usual slow rhythm. There was no sign of Mr. Abernathy. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. She approached the station master, a harried man with a green eyeshade pushed up on his balding head. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice sounding thin and reedy to her own ears. "I'm looking for Mr. Elias Abernathy. He was to meet me here." The station master squinted at her, his gaze taking in her expensive, if travel-worn, attire. He grunted, wiping a hand on his ink-stained trousers. "Abernathy? Elias Abernathy." He shook his head slowly. "Fella sold his claim about a month back. Lit out for California, I heard. Said the winters here were too hard on his constitution." He delivered the news with the flat, emotionless finality of a telegram. The world seemed to tilt beneath Alara's feet. The noise of the street faded to a dull roar in her ears. Stranded. The word was a clang of a cell door shutting. She had spent nearly every cent she possessed on the train ticket. She had sold her late mother's pearls. She had burned every bridge to her old life, a life of genteel poverty as the unwanted ward of a distant aunt. Mr. Abernathy's letters had been her lifeline, her one desperate gamble for a future that was her own. And he was gone. She was alone, in a dusty, raw town at what felt like the very edge of the civilized world, with less than $5 to her name. The station master, seeing the blood drain from her face, softened slightly. "Look, miss, the boarding house is just down the street. Ma Higgins runs it. It ain't the Copley Plaza, but it's a roof." He gestured vaguely before turning back to his manifest, his part in her burgeoning disaster concluded. Caleb rode into town later that afternoon, the bed of his wagon loaded with the hides he was trading for flour, salt, and coffee. He kept his eyes forward, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He wanted to conclude his business and be gone before the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains. But he couldn't miss the woman standing forlornly beside the train station. She was still there, a solitary figure in a blue dress, looking as out of place as a porcelain teacup on a branding fire. He saw the way a few local loafers were watching her, their speculative gazes like dirty hands. He felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his gut. It was not his concern. He had learned, through bitter experience, that getting involved in the troubles of others was a fool's errand. He was tying his horse to the hitching post in front of the general store when Sheriff Brody approached him. The sheriff was a man whose age had settled into his bones, but whose eyes were still sharp and missed little. "Caleb," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Got a moment?" "Just for a moment, Sam," Caleb replied, not turning from his task. "Got fences to mend before dark. It's about the lady," the sheriff said, nodding his head toward the station. "The one your eyes have been boring a hole through since you rode in." Caleb stiffened, but said nothing. "Name's Alara Vance. Came from back east. Supposed to marry Elias Abernathy. Abernathy's a fool who ran from the first sign of winter," Caleb stated flatly. "And she's a bigger fool for believing a man she's never met." The words were harsher than he intended, a defense against the flicker of sympathy he felt. "Maybe so," the sheriff conceded, his gaze steady. "But that don't change the fact that she's here, and she's alone. She's got no money and nowhere to go. Ma Higgins's place is full of rough men from the mining camps this week. It's no place for a woman like her." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Caleb was the only man for miles with a respectable ranch and a housekeeper to act as chaperone. Caleb finally turned to face the sheriff, his expression a mask of stone. "No, Sam. My place is not a charity house for naive women. She can take the next train back to wherever she came from." "With what money, Caleb?" "She spent it all getting here." Just then, two of the loafers detached themselves from the saloon wall and began to walk toward Alara. Their swagger was predatory. "Damn it," the sheriff muttered. Before he could move, Caleb was already striding across the street, his long legs eating up the distance. His movements were fluid and silent, the quiet deadliness of him a palpable thing. Alara saw the man approaching, and her heart leaped into her throat. She instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her chest. "Well now, look what the train brought in," one of them drawled, his teeth stained with tobacco. A pretty little bird, all alone, before his companion could add his own crude remark, a shadow fell over them. Caleb stopped directly in front of them, his height and broad shoulders blocking their path to Alara. He didn't speak. He simply looked at them, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones in winter. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. The men, who had been full of bluster a moment before, seemed to shrink under that silent, unwavering gaze. They exchanged a nervous glance, mumbled something incoherent, and shuffled away, melting back into the shadows of the saloon. Caleb did not watch them go. His attention was now on the woman. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, a spark of defiance. Her chin was up, her back straight. She was not as fragile as she looked. "You are Miss Vance?" he stated. It was not a question. "I am," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly. "And I thank you for your intervention, sir, though I believe I could have handled them." A corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile. "I have no doubt. But my wagon is faster." He turned and walked toward his wagon without waiting for a reply. He was already regretting this. Deeply. He loaded his supplies, the sacks of flour and coffee feeling heavier than usual. When he turned back, she was still there, watching him, a look of uncertainty on her face. Martha, his housekeeper, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, had emerged from the general store and was now standing beside Alara, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. He saw Martha pat Alara's arm, and he knew he was lost. Martha's maternal instincts were a force of nature that could level mountains. "Caleb Blackwood," Martha called out, her voice carrying the authority of a general. "You will not leave this poor child to the wolves. She will come with us to the ranch until the circuit judge arrives next month. He can sort out her legal predicament." "Martha!" "That is not," he began, but the look on his housekeeper's face cut him short. It was a look that had quelled him since he was a boy stealing cookies from her cooling rack. He sighed, the sound a mix of resignation and fury at his own weakness. "Fine," he bit out. "Get in the wagon." He moved to help Alara up onto the high seat, his hand closing around her arm. Her sleeve was thin wool, and he could feel the delicate bones of her forearm, the warmth of her skin. The contact was like a static shock, a jolt of unwelcome life in the numb landscape of his existence. She stumbled slightly on the step, her balance lost for a moment, and she fell against his chest. For a brief second, he was holding her, his other arm coming around her waist to steady her. He could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, a clean, sweet smell that was utterly foreign to his world of leather, dust, and pine. Her gasp was a soft puff of air against his shirt. He set her upright on the seat as if she were a hot coal, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second too long. He stepped back quickly, his face grim, and moved to the other side of the wagon, his own heart beating a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. He had just allowed the floodwaters to breach his fortress. The journey to the ranch was made in a strained silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness. Alara sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, acutely aware of the man beside her. He was a wall of silent disapproval, his profile sharp and unyielding against the fading light. She stole glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. He was not a handsome man in the classical sense she was used to. His face was too harsh, his features carved from some unforgiving stone and weathered by the elements. But there was a raw power in his stillness, a sense of deep, contained strength that was both intimidating and strangely compelling. She had seen the way those two men had withered under his gaze. He had not needed to raise his voice or his hand. His presence alone had been enough. She was mortified by her situation, a charity case taken in by a reluctant stranger. Her pride, the only real possession she had left, was in tatters. Yet, as the wagon climbed out of the dusty bowl of the town and into the rolling hills, A sense of wonder began to creep through her despair. The landscape was breathtaking. The sky was a vast, open canvas of orange, pink, and violet as the sun sank behind the mountains. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and wild herbs. It was a land of stark, savage beauty, so different from the manicured green of New England. It was terrifying, but it was also magnificent. Caleb felt her gaze on him, a light, persistent touch he could not shake. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands firm on the reins. Having her this close was a profound disruption. Her scent, that clean lavender, was a constant reminder of her presence. He was used to Martha's comfortable, motherly aura, but this was different. This was the presence of a woman, young and vibrant. It stirred memories he had fought for years to bury. Memories of another woman's warmth beside him, the scent of her hair, the sound of her laughter. He clenched his jaw, forcing the ghosts back into their graves. This woman, Elara Vance, was a complication, a temporary problem to be managed and then dispatched. He would see her safely on the next train east, and then his life would return to its quiet, orderly state. They arrived at the ranch as twilight deepened into night. The log house was larger than she had expected, solid and well-built, with a long porch running its length. Light spilled from the windows, a warm, yellow invitation in the gathering dark. Martha bustled ahead of them, lighting lamps and stirring the fire in the main room's large stone hearth. The room was simple, masculine, with a large wooden table, a few sturdy chairs, and shelves filled with books. A rifle rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. It was a space built for function, not comfort, yet the firelight softened its hard edges, making it feel like a sanctuary. "You'll take the spare room at the back, dear," Martha said, guiding Elara through the house. "It's small, but the bed is soft. Caleb, bring in her valise." Her tone left no room for argument. Caleb followed, placing her bag just inside the doorway of the room. It was sparse, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small washstand, and a single window that looked out into the darkness. It was also, Elara noted with a blush, right next to his own room. She could hear him moving about, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. The intimacy of the small house was unnerving. Dinner was a quiet affair. Martha served a hearty beef stew, and Elara, who hadn't realized how hungry she was, ate with a gratitude that went beyond the food. It was the simple act of being cared for, of being safe, that brought a lump to her throat. Caleb ate with an economy of motion, his eyes on his plate. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elara felt she had to break it, to acknowledge her debt. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "I cannot properly express my gratitude. You have shown me a great kindness today, and I promise I will not be a burden. I'm a hard worker. I can cook and sew, and I'm willing to learn whatever is needed to earn my keep until I can arrange for passage home." He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers across the table. For the first time, she saw something other than hardness in them. A flicker of something. Weariness, perhaps. "Martha is the cook," he said, his voice a low baritone. "And she has no need for a sewing circle. You are a guest. You will remain here until the next train east arrives in 2 weeks. I will pay for your ticket." His words, meant perhaps as a reassurance, stung her pride. "I cannot accept such charity," she insisted. "My father taught me to pay my own way. Your father is not here," he stated, the words falling with blunt finality. "This is my home. You will abide by my rules." The conversation was over. He pushed his chair back, took his plate to the wash basin, and then retreated to the far side of the room, picking up a book. He was shutting her out, erecting his walls of silence once more. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Elara, determined not to be idle, rose early with Martha. She insisted on helping with the chores, learning to knead bread, tend the small vegetable garden, and feed the chickens. The work was physical and demanding, so different from a needlepoint and piano lessons that had filled her days in Boston. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and calloused. But with the physical labor came a sense of satisfaction she had never known. She was contributing, creating something tangible. She was not merely an ornament waiting to be claimed. She rarely saw Caleb during the day. He would be gone before she woke, out on the vast expanse of his land, and would return long after dusk, tired and covered in dust. They shared their evening meals in that same tense silence. Yet, she found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his horse's hooves in the yard. She would watch him from the window as he unsaddled his horse, his movements sure and graceful, a perfect union of man and animal. She saw the gentleness with which he treated the creature, a stark contrast to his gruffness with people. One evening, seeking a respite from the confines of the house, she was sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to pepper the darkening sky. The sheer number of them was astonishing, a diamond dust scattered across black velvet. He came to stand in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the warm light from inside. He did not speak for a long time, simply stood there, sharing the vast silence with her. "You should not be out here alone," he said finally, his voice startling her. "And why is that?" she asked, turned to look up at him. "Are the stars so dangerous in Wyoming?" He did not smile at her attempt at levity. "There are other things in the night. Coyotes, mountain lions. Two-legged predators are the worst, like the men in town," she stated quietly. "The ones you saved me from," he grunted a noncommittal sound, and came to sit on the top step, a careful distance away. He smelled of horse, leather, and the clean scent of the pine-scented soap Martha made. "They were fools. Harmless. Mostly, they did not seem harmless to me," she confessed. "Back home, men are more civilized in their advances. There is no civilization here," he said, his voice flat. "There is only survival. People take what they think they can get. You look like something to be taken." Soft, breakable, his assessment, so baldly stated, should have angered her. Instead, it challenged her. "I'm not breakable, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice firm. "My circumstances may be reduced, but I am not. I have survived the loss of my parents, poverty, and the humiliation of being abandoned. I assure you, I am made of stronger material than you think." He turned his head and looked at her, then truly looked at her in the faint starlight. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the unwavering clarity in her eyes. He had seen that same strength in his Sarah. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He looked away quickly, back toward the dark horizon. "Perhaps," he conceded, his voice rough. They sat in silence again, but it was different now. A small bridge of understanding had been built between them in the darkness. Later that week, a late-season storm blew in from the north, trapping them all inside the house. The wind howled around the eaves, and rain lashed against the windows. Caleb worked by the fire, mending a broken piece of harness leather, his large hands surprisingly deft. Alara was trying to read, but her thoughts kept drifting. She found herself studying him, the way the firelight cast shadows on his stark face, the concentration in the set of his brow. Her gaze fell upon a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece. It was worn smooth with handling. On an impulse, she rose and picked it up. It was a meadowlark, its head tilted as if in mid-song. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "Did you make it?" Caleb froze, his hands stilling their work. The blood seemed to drain from his face, leaving it a pale, taut mask. "Put it down," he said, his voice dangerously low. Startled by his reaction, she quickly placed the bird back on the mantel. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It was my son's," he cut in, the words torn from him. He did not look at her, but stared into the fire, his eyes seeing something far away. His name was Thomas. He loved the sound of the meadowlarks in the spring. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. "My wife, Sarah, she and Thomas. They died 3 years ago. Diphtheria." It took them both in less than a week. The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. Alara's heart ached for him. The immense, crushing weight of his solitude suddenly made sense. It wasn't a preference, it was a scar. It was the empty space left by a love so great its loss had hollowed him out. She did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. She knew from her own grief how useless they were. Instead, she walked over to the hearth and knelt, not too close, but near enough to offer a silent presence. "My parents died of fever, too," she shared, her voice barely a whisper. "One winter in Boston. It was very fast. One day, our house was full of warmth and laughter. The next, it was just quiet. So quiet." She looked at her hands, twisting in her lap. "That is why I answered Mr. Abernathy's advertisement. I had nowhere else to go. I was so afraid of the silence." He finally looked at her, and the ice in his eyes had melted, replaced by a shared, profound sorrow. In that moment, they were not a gruff rancher and a stranded lady from the East. They were two survivors, two people who understood the unique shape of a life hollowed out by loss. He gave a single, sharp nod, an acknowledgement of her pain and of his own. He said nothing more, but when he picked up the piece of leather again, his hands were not quite steady. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the walls of their individual fortresses had begun to crumble. The storm passed, and the world outside was washed clean, smelling of damp earth and sage. The atmosphere in the house had changed, too. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a more comfortable quiet, punctuated by small, tentative conversations. He started talking to her, asking about the books she read, about the city she came from. She, in turn, asked him about the ranch, about the cattle, about the names of the wildflowers that grew by the creek. He began to see the keen intelligence behind her refined manners, her genuine curiosity about his world. She saw the deep knowledge he possessed of the land, the quiet pride he took in his work. A fragile respect was growing between them. One afternoon, he found her in the yard, struggling to split kindling with a hatchet, her movements clumsy and ineffective. He watched for a moment, a rare smile touching his lips before he walked over. "You'll take your hand off that way," he said, his voice laced with gruff amusement. He took the hatchet from her, his fingers brushing hers. The now familiar jolt passed between them. "Watch," he instructed. He showed her how to place the wood, how to swing from the shoulder, letting the weight of the axe do the work. His hands guided hers on the handle, his body close behind her. She was acutely aware of his warmth, of the solid wall of his chest at her back. Her breath caught in her throat. He seemed to realize their proximity at the same moment and stepped back abruptly, his face unreadable. "Practice," he said gruffly, before turning and striding toward the barn, leaving her with a racing heart and a pile of unsplit wood. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a visitor. A man on a fine black horse rode into the yard one morning. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit and polished boots that seemed absurdly out of place. He introduced himself as Silas Croft, a name Caleb clearly recognized. Croft's smile was wide, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Blackwood," Croft said, dismounting with a flourish. "I've been meaning to come out and see you. I'm buying up some of the surrounding properties. Making an offer on yours." A generous 1 inch, he named a figure that was, in fact, insultingly low. Caleb stood on his porch, his arms crossed, his expression impassive. "The ranch is not for sale," Croft's smile tightened. "Everything is for sale, my friend, for the right price. This is hard country. A man alone can't hold out forever. Your water rights alone are worth a fortune to me." His gaze slid past Caleb to where Alara had just stepped out of the house, drawn by the voices. His eyes lingered on her, his expression turning oily and appreciative. Well, perhaps not so alone after all. It seems you have found yourself some company." A man needs comforts. Caleb moved so fast he seemed to blur. He was off the porch and standing in front of Croft in 2 silent strides. He was inches from the other man's face, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "You will not speak of her. You will get on your horse, and you will get off my land." Now the pleasant facade dropped from Croft's face, replaced by a sneer. "Have it your way, Blackwood. But I always get what I want." He swung himself back onto his horse, shot one last, lingering look at Alara, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in his wake. The incident cast a long shadow. Caleb became even more withdrawn, his watchfulness intensified. He began carrying his rifle with him wherever he went on the property. A few days later, he found a section of his northern fence cut, a dozen head of cattle scattered. It was a message, a warning. The work of recovering the animals took him 2 full days, and he returned exhausted and grim-faced. He knew this was only the beginning. Croft was not a man who gave up easily. Alara felt the tension coiling in the house. She saw the worry etched around Caleb's eyes, the way his hand rarely strayed far from the Colt revolver on his hip. She wanted to help, to offer some comfort, but she did not know how. She was a liability, another thing for him to worry about, to protect. The thought was galling. She had just begun to feel as if she belonged, as if she were finding her footing in this new world. Now, she was once again the cause of trouble. Her 2 weeks were nearly up. The train was due in 3 days. The subject hung between them, unspoken. The thought of leaving filled her with a profound, aching sadness that surprised her with its intensity. Leaving this harsh, beautiful land. Leaving Martha. Leaving him. The idea was unbearable. This place, this simple log house, had become more of a home to her in 2 weeks than her aunt's cold Boston townhouse had been in years. Wanting a few moments of peace, she walked down to the creek that bordered the property, a place that had become her sanctuary. The cottonwoods whispered in the breeze, and the water chuckled over smooth stones. She sat on a large, sun-warmed rock, trailing her fingers in the cool current, trying to sort out the tangle of her emotions. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the riders until they were almost upon her. 2 men, their faces coarse and unfamiliar, reined in their horses on the opposite bank. She recognized them as 2 of Croft's ranch hands she had seen in town. Her blood ran cold. "Look what we have here, Billy," one of them said with a leering grin. "It's the boss's pretty bird, strayed from her cage." Alara scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I am on Mr. Blackwood's property," she said, her voice shaking but loud. "You are trespassing." "Oh, we know where we are." The other man, Billy replied, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "We just have a message for your protector. Mr. Croft wants him to reconsider his offer. Thought a little chat with you might." Persuade him, he urged his horse into the shallow water, starting to cross the creek toward her. Panic seized her. She turned to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The world narrowed to the sound of splashing water and the thudding of her own heart. Just as the man's horse gained the bank, a voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as a razor. "That's far enough." Caleb was there, atop the ridge behind her, mounted on his own horse. He had his rifle in his hand, not aimed, but held with a casual readiness that was more terrifying than any overt threat. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes chips of ice. The 2 men froze, their bravado evaporating. "Now, Blackwood," the first man stammered, raising his hands. "We was just talking to the lady. Your conversation is over," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I know who you work for. You can take a message back to Croft for me. The next time any of his men set foot on my land, I will consider it an act of war. I will not be so polite. Do you understand me?" The men nodded dumbly, their eyes wide. They backed their horses away, turned, and spurred them into a frantic gallop, disappearing over the rise. Caleb dismounted in a single, fluid motion and strode toward Alara. He reached her, and his hands closed on her upper arms, his grip tight, almost painful. He wasn't looking at her, but the spot where the men had vanished, his jaw working. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with a fury she didn't understand. "No, I'm fine," she whispered, shaken. He finally looked down at her, and what she saw in his eyes shocked her. It was not just anger. It was raw, naked fear. The sight of it stole her breath. He was afraid for her. He pulled her against him in a rough, desperate embrace, his arms wrapping around her as if to shield her from the entire world. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder rack his powerful frame. The embrace lasted only a moment before he seemed to catch himself. He pushed her away, his hands still on her shoulders, holding her at arm's length. The fear in his eyes was quickly being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "That settles it," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're on the train on Saturday. I'm taking you into town myself. This is no place for you. You'll get yourself killed here." The words were like a slap in the face. After that moment of connection, of shared terror, he was pushing her away again, harder than ever. She misunderstood his fear for her safety as an accusation of her weakness. He saw her as a burden, a liability who couldn't even walk to a creek without causing trouble. The hurt was a sharp, physical pain in her chest, followed by a surge of white-hot anger. "Because I'm too soft and breakable?" she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because I am a woman, and therefore a constant victim in need of rescue? Because this is my fight, not yours," he thundered, his control finally snapping. "Croft wants my land. He will use anything, anyone to get it. He will use you. I will not have your death on my conscience. So your solution is to cast me out?" she cried, her heart breaking. "To send me back to a life with nothing, to a place that is no longer my home, just to soothe your own conscience?" "You do not have a home here," he retorted, his words as cruel as a whip. "You have a place to stay. There is a difference. You are an Eastern lady who does not belong in this world. The sooner you accept that, the better." Each word was a hammer blow to the fragile hope she had been nurturing. Tears of anger and pain welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing. "Fine," she said, her voice cold and brittle. "I will be more than happy to leave your precious solitude undisturbed. Do not worry, Mr. Blackwood. Come Saturday, you will be well rid of this liability." She wrenched herself from his grasp and turned, running back toward the house, her vision blurred. She did not see the look of utter devastation on his face as he watched her go. He had done it. He had pushed her away. He had protected her the only way he knew how. And in doing so, he had shattered something vital within himself. The silence that rushed back in to fill the space she left was no longer peaceful. It was agonizing. The next 2 days were an exercise in misery. Alara kept to her room or helped Martha in the kitchen, her movements stiff with wounded pride. She and Caleb did not speak. They avoided each other's eyes at the dinner table, the air between them thick with unspoken words and hurt feelings. The house, which had started to feel like a home, now felt like a prison. Alara packed her small valise, her hands moving mechanically. Each folded garment was a farewell to a future she had foolishly allowed herself to imagine. A future with a quiet, wounded man and a life of stark, honest beauty. On Friday night, the eve of her departure, the air was unnaturally still. The usual chorus of crickets was silent. An oppressive weight seemed to hang over the ranch. Caleb stood on the porch, staring out into the inky darkness, a sense of foreboding crawling up his spine. He felt exposed, vulnerable, not for himself, but for the woman sleeping inside his house. The woman whose imminent departure felt like a physical amputation. He had been a fool. He had driven away the first ray of light to enter his life in 3 years, all in the name of a twisted, selfish notion of protection. A flicker of orange in the distance caught his eye. Near the barn. It wasn't a lantern. It grew, blossoming with terrifying speed. Fire. The word was ripped from his throat. He grabbed the rifle from its pegs by the door and burst out into the yard. The hay in the barn had caught, and the dry timber was going up like a torch, flames leaping into the night sky. It was a diversion. He knew it instantly. As if on cue, a rifle shot cracked from the darkness, splintering the doorframe next to his head. He dove back inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and dropping the bar into place. "Alara! Martha! Get down!" he yelled. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, peppering the walls of the house. Glass shattered as a window in the main room exploded inward. Alara, awakened by the noise, ran from her room, her face pale with terror. Martha was already there, her face grim, holding an old shotgun. "It's Croft," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm as he moved to a window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "He's come to finish it. What do we do?" Alara asked, her voice shaking. "We fight," he said simply. He handed her a spare revolver. Do you know how to use this? She shook her head, her eyes wide. Just point it and pull the trigger. Don't stop until it's empty. The assault was relentless. Bullets thudded into the logs of the house. The roar of the burning barn was a constant, terrifying backdrop. Caleb was a formidable defender, moving from window to window, his shots measured and precise. A cry from the darkness told him one of his shots had found its mark, but he knew they were heavily outnumbered. It was only a matter of time. A flaming torch arced through the broken window, landing on a bearskin rug. Flames immediately began to lick at the dry material. Before Caleb could move, Alara was there, grabbing a heavy wool blanket from a nearby chest. Without a thought for her own safety, she smothered the flames, beating them out with a desperate ferocity. Her fear was a living thing inside her, but her determination was stronger. She would not be a helpless victim. She would not let this house, this man, be destroyed. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow. They were using a log as a battering ram. The bar groaned, the wood splintering. "Get back!" Caleb yelled, pulling Alara and Martha toward the back of the house. The door burst open, and two figures silhouetted against the firelight spilled into the room. Caleb's rifle roared, and the first man fell. Before he could chamber another round, the second man was on him. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, struggling for control of the rifle. From the corner of her eye, Alara saw another of Croft's men creeping in through the broken window. He was raising his pistol, aiming at Caleb's back. There was no time to think. Alara screamed a wordless cry of rage and terror. She grabbed the heaviest object she could find, the cast-iron skillet Martha had left on the hearth. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. The distraction was all Caleb needed. He drove his elbow into his attacker's throat and wrenched the rifle free. He brought the stock up in a brutal arc, catching the man under the jaw. The fight was over in a matter of seconds. Silence, heavy and ringing, fell over the room, broken only by the roar of the fire outside and their own ragged breathing. They were cornered, trapped in the kitchen. They could hear more men shouting outside. It felt like the end. Caleb pushed Alara and Martha behind him, standing as a lone bastion between them and the doorway. He looked back at Alara, his face grimy with smoke, a cut bleeding on his forehead. The cold mask was gone, stripped away by the violence and the imminent threat of death. All he saw was her courage, her fierce, defiant spirit. The woman who had faced down his demons and her own, and had swung an iron skillet like a Valkyrie. "Alara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He had to say it. He might not get another chance. "I was wrong. I was a damned fool, Caleb." "Don't," she started, her eyes filling with tears. "No, listen to me," he insisted, his gaze holding hers, intense and burning. "Pushing you away. It was the act of a coward. I was so afraid of losing someone again that I couldn't see what I was gaining. I was hiding in the dark, and you brought the light. I can't lose you, Alara. Not now. Not ever." It was not a poetic declaration. It was a raw, desperate confession, torn from the very heart of him. "I love you," he whispered, the words tasting strange and wonderful on his tongue. Through her tears, she gave him a watery, brilliant smile. "You won't lose me," she said, her voice filled with a strength that matched his own. "We will get through this together." Just as a new wave of attackers prepared to rush the house, a volley of gunfire erupted from a new direction, from the ridge overlooking the ranch. Shouts of "Sheriff's posse" echoed through the night. The tide had turned. Sheriff Brody and a group of deputized townsmen, alerted by the glow of the fire, had arrived. Croft's remaining men, caught between two fires, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Silas Croft himself was found among the fallen, brought down by one of Caleb's first shots. The immediate danger was over. The yard was filled with men, smoke, and the aftermath of violence. But inside the besieged house, the world had shrunk to the space between two people. Caleb moved toward Alara, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. The quiet tenderness of the gesture, after the brutality of the fight, was her undoing. A sob escaped her, and she collapsed against him, her arms wrapping around his neck. He held her tightly, his own body trembling with reaction. They stood there for a long time, clinging to each other amidst the wreckage, two solitary souls who had finally, irrevocably, found their other half. The dawn broke, pale and gray, over a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoking ruin, the house was scarred with bullet holes, and the yard was a mess of debris. But as the first rays of sunlight touched the valley, they brought with them not despair, but the promise of a new day. Alara and Caleb stood on the porch, watching the sun rise together, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The exhaustion was bone deep, but beneath it was a profound sense of peace. The external storm was over, and so was the internal one. "I am so sorry, Caleb," she said softly, looking at the charred remains of the barn. "All of this. It was because of me." He turned to her, taking her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, reverent. "No," he said, his voice firm. "This was because of a greedy man's evil. You were not the cause of the fight, Alara. You were the reason I won it. You were what I was fighting for." He looked in her eyes, his own filled with a deep, unwavering sincerity. "My life was a house with no windows, locked from the inside. You didn't just knock on the door. You broke it down. You filled it with light. Don't you ever think you were a burden?" He reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple, thin gold band, warmed by the patina of age. "This was my mother's ring," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And then it was Sarah's. After she died, I put it away. I thought I was burying my heart with it. I thought I would never have the right or the courage to offer it to anyone again." He took a deep breath. "But my past doesn't have to be my future. You've shown me that. You've shown me that a heart can be broken and still learn to beat again, to love again." Tears streamed freely down Alara's face, but they were tears of joy. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice choked. "Alara Vance," he said, his voice shaking slightly with the weight of his own vulnerability. "I'm not an easy man. I am scarred and quiet, and I know little of the world you came from. But I love you, more than I thought it was possible to love again. Will you do me the honor of building a new life with me? Here? Will you be my wife?" She didn't need to say the word. She launched herself into his arms, her answer a resounding kiss that sealed their promise, a beacon of hope in the smoky morning air. "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Oh yes, Caleb. Always, yes." News of the attack and of Caleb Blackwood's impending marriage spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. The change in the man was a source of constant gossip and wonder. The stone-faced loner was seen in town more often, and while he was still a man of few words, there was a new light in his eyes. And always at his side was Alara, her own happiness a radiant glow that seemed to warm everyone she met. The community, which could have been judgmental and cruel, instead rallied around them. Perhaps it was respect for the way they had defended their home, or perhaps it was the simple, undeniable power of their story. When the day came to rebuild the barn, it was not just Caleb working. Sheriff Brody was there, along with the blacksmith, the general store owner, and a dozen other ranchers and townsfolk. They came with hammers, saws, and strongbacks. The women of the town, led by a beaming Martha, descended upon the ranch with baskets of food and bolts of fabric. They helped Alara mend the house, sew new curtains, and plan the wedding. They saw in her not a helpless Eastern lady, but a woman of grit and substance, a true pioneer spirit. She had earned her place among them not by birth or by marriage, but by her own courage. The wedding was held a month later, on a clear, bright afternoon. It wasn't in the town's small church, but in the yard of the ranch, in front of the newly raised frame of the barn, a symbol of their shared future, built from the ashes of the past. Alara wore a simple dress of cream-colored linen, a gift from the women of the town. In her hair, she wore a crown of the same wildflowers she had once asked Caleb to name for her. Caleb stood waiting for her, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a new shirt and jacket, but his eyes when they found hers were filled with a love so profound it made her heart ache. The circuit judge, a man with a booming voice and kind eyes, performed the ceremony. The whole town was there, their presence a warm blanket of support. As they said their vows, their voices clear and steady in the afternoon quiet, a meadowlark began to sing from its perch on the new barn's roofline, its song a liquid, joyful blessing. Caleb squeezed her hand, a small, secret smile passing between them. The ghosts of the past were finally at peace. 2 years later, the Wyoming sun, a benevolent gold in the late afternoon, slanted across the valley. The Blackwood Ranch was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a thriving homestead. The barn stood tall and proud, filled with hay and the lowing of cattle. The log house had a new wing, and the porch was wider, with a rocking chair and a swing. In the garden Alara had planted vibrant splashes of color. Hollyhocks, sunflowers, and roses stood in cheerful defiance of the harsh landscape. The entire property hummed with a quiet, contented life. Caleb sat on the porch steps, the same steps where he and Alara had once sat as wary strangers. In his hands was a piece of soft pine, and with a small, sharp knife, he was slowly, patiently carving. His large, calloused hands moved with a familiar, gentle grace. At his side, a small boy with a shock of honey-blonde hair and his father's serious gray eyes watched with rapt attention. "See, Daniel," Caleb said softly, "you have to go with the grain. You can't force it." He shaved off a perfect, curling sliver of wood. The boy, not yet 3, reached out a chubby finger to touch the smooth curve of the emerging shape. It was a horse, small and simple. It was not the first toy Caleb had carved, nor would it be the last. The house was filled with them. Alara came out onto the porch, carrying a glass of lemonade. She was radiant, her face glowing with health and happiness. Her body was fuller, her belly round with the promise of their second child, due in the autumn. She paused for a moment, simply watching her husband and her son, her heart swelling with a love so vast it felt as though it might overflow. This was the life she had dreamed of, a life she had never known was possible. A life of purpose, of partnership, of profound, abiding love. Caleb looked up, as if sensing her presence, and his eyes met hers. In that shared gaze was a universe of understanding, a silent conversation that spoke of shared struggles, deep joys, and a future they faced as one. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that transformed his rugged face, making him look younger, freer. He rose and walked to her, taking the lemonade and setting it on the railing. He placed one hand on her rounded stomach, feeling the faint flutter of the life within, and the other on her cheek. "I never thought I'd know this kind of peace again," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble. "I used to think silence was peace. I was wrong." He gestured to the boy playing on the steps, to her, to the home they had built. "This is peace." Alara leaned into his touch, her eyes shining. She covered his hand with her own, her simple gold wedding band warm against his skin. "Home isn't a place you find, Caleb," she whispered, her voice full of love and conviction. "It's something you build. And we, my love, we built it together." He lowered his head and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss filled with the comfortable certainty of 1,000 shared tomorrows. Daniel looked up from his new toy and giggled, a bright, happy sound that echoed in the warm air. Together, the 3 of them, soon to be 4, stood on the porch of their home, looking out over the vast, beautiful land that was theirs, a family forged in fire and loss, and rebuilt by the enduring, life-giving power of love. The sun began to set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors of a new beginning, and a meadowlark, as if on cue, began its evening song.